Good day. The German operator of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline says that construction of the pipeline is now 98% complete, and the building of the pipeline is expected to be finished in August. The German operator also says that it will take a further 3 months after the completion of the building work on the pipeline for the various certificates and permits to be provided, and then the pipeline should be in full operation, meaning that it will be in operation by the end of this year. The sanctions that the US government, the Trump administration, imposed on the pipeline, therefore postponed its completion by about 1.5 years, but so far have not managed to kill it. All on the contrary, all the indications are that the pipeline will now be finished and will be in operation this year, and that there is nothing that can be done to prevent it. I say nothing, though, as I discussed a short while ago in another program, there is another attempt underway by Senator Ted Cruz in the United States to stop the pipeline by blocking the appointment of Biden administration nominees to the State Department, 13 apparently, and there are also moves afoot in Congress to try to impose further sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline before it is completed, perhaps with the view to trying to killing the pipeline stone dead. But to be frank and realistic, the completion of this pipeline now looks a certainty. And as I said, it is most likely going to enter into full production sometime this year. Moreover, the hopes that some had that the Greens would be able to stop the pipeline from being completed, the German Greens would stop the pipeline from being completed if they won the German election in September, seem to be melting away with the support of the Greens, which is declining, as I discussed in another program I did for this channel. I would say that the Greens' wish to stop Nord Stream 2 may, in fact, have been one of the reasons why their support in Germany has dwindled, because so many German jobs and German businesses depend upon cheap gas from Russia, and the Greens taking the stance that they are taking could be said or perceived by many Germans as being inimical to the development of the German economy. Anyway, all of this is very interesting, and as I said, the completion of Nord Stream 2, which, as I said, now looks a virtual certainty, is an interesting and important fact in itself, though, as I have said, one whose political effects will be, in my opinion, greatly overstated. I certainly don't think that the Russians will be able to use Nord Stream 2 to force Europe to take any political measures it doesn't want to take. I think the claims that Nord Stream 2 provides Russia with political leverage over Europe are fantastical. And I also believe that the idea that it will lead to a general rapprochement between Germany and Russia and will cause Germany to in some way become detached from NATO and the EU are fantasies also. This was, as I have always said, a German project. It was the Germans who proposed its construction to the Russians back in 2015 in order to make up for the gap in energy supplies, which was caused by Angela Merkel's decision following the Fukushima nuclear accident to phase out Germany's nuclear power industry. This is a German idea, one which the Russians had to be brought round to, but one which eventually they agreed to. And by the way, this constant claim that Nord Stream 2 is not a commercial pipeline and is not a commercial project is refuted by the simple facts. Again, as I recently discussed in another program, the cost of Nord Stream 2 will, according to the information the Ukrainians themselves are giving, be recouped in 3 or 4 years at most in what Russia will save on the transit fees it is paying at the moment to Ukraine. People who go on insisting that Nord Stream 2 is not necessary and that Russia should continue to pipe all its gas through Ukraine are ultimately and basically saying that Russia should continue to provide a financial subsidy to Ukraine and to its economy at a time when Ukraine is pursuing exceptionally hostile policies towards Russia. Not only does Nord Stream 2 make political sense from a Russian point of view, cutting out to a certain extent, though not completely, a hostile and unreliable transit state, it also makes commercial sense, cutting out a middleman and saving Russia the cost of the transit fees. It always bewilders me that countries that seem so ready to sanction other countries and to impose financial and economic hardships on them simply refuse to acknowledge the economic logic of Nord Stream 2, which is accepted by the Germans and by the Russians too, and which Ukraine, to a very great extent, brought on itself. Anyway, that's putting it all aside. The important fact is that at the moment, both the US and Russia are now assessing the state of play after what increasingly looks like the imminent completion of Nord Stream 2. And of course, in the case of the United States, this comes alongside a trip by Angela Merkel to Washington, where she will be meeting with President Biden of the United States and with other US officials in what is clearly a valedictory tour shortly before Merkel quits the chancellery in Germany, which she will at the conclusion of the forthcoming elections, and which I also suspect prepares Merkel for the future job which is to come, since I do not believe that Merkel is intending to retire, but I suspect is strongly looking for a future job in what possibly in Washington with an institution like the World Bank or perhaps the IMF or who knows, some other. And she will be lobbying in Washington for support to get that. Anyway, on her way, she has been greeted by an extraordinarily savage editorial in Bloomberg, a publication, and which is, of course, extremely close to the Democratic Party. Bloomberg himself was, as we all no doubt remember, a candidate in the primaries during the presidential election, the US presidential election last year. Indeed, at this time last year, many of us were talking about the prospects, his prospects as a candidate, or perhaps is more fair to say somewhat earlier in the year. But anyway, Bloomberg is known to be close to the Democrats, and this publication, this editorial, I strongly suspect, reflects some of the feelings within the administration and amongst the Democrats towards Merkel at the moment, which shows that she's going to have her work cut out mending fences and building bridges when she is in Washington, if she does indeed want this future job, which I'm sure she does. And it's perhaps worth reading this editorial in full, because it's really quite astonishing how angry and aggressive it comes over. Just months before she retires from politics, German Chancellor Angela Merkel is jetting to Washington to meet US President Joe Biden. The event will be staged to show a return to transatlantic harmony after 4 years of acrimony under Biden's predecessor, Donald Trump. But to keep up those appearances, the Americans will be hiding a crushing sense of disappointment and the Germans' annoying anxiety. In different ways, both Merkel and Biden have been foils to Trump, not least by representing multilateralism and cooperation rather than nationalism. So Biden and his team were hoping for a big show of support from Merkel, especially in confronting the autocratic antagonists of the democratic West, China and Russia. Instead, Merkel has, in the cloaked and understated way that is her wont, snubbed Biden twice. The first affront occurred in December, just weeks before Biden was to take his oath of office, when she pushed a Chinese-European investment deal into its next phase without even consulting Biden's team. Instead of helping Washington to constrain Beijing, Merkel wants Europe to keep its options open. The second and worse snub was her refusal to move even an inch towards bipartisan American demands regarding a controversial gas pipeline being built from Russia to Germany. Called Nord Stream 2 and more than 90% finished, it doubles the amount of gas Russia can export directly under the Baltic Sea to northwest Europe. And then the article continues with all the usual stuff that I have talked about previously, both on this program and on others, about how Nord Stream 2 is not an economic project, but is a political project, how it enables the Russians to blackmail Europe, how it will provide the Russians with an opportunity to increase pressure on Ukraine, and how it cuts out Ukraine as a potential transit state. And then the article concludes by discussing how the Germans are talking about doing various things to try to protect Ukraine, for example, by providing Ukraine with some kind of financial compensation after Nord Stream 2 is completed. Well, I've already said that this is all nonsense, that from both a German and a Russian point of view, cutting out a costly and unreliable middleman in the form of Ukraine makes complete sense, that the Russians will recover the cost of building Nord Stream 2 by the reduction in the transit fees that they pay to Ukraine, and that Germany will secure a cheap supply of Russian gas whilst it completes its transition to the various new forms of energy which are supposed to represent fossil fuels. I would add that Nord Stream 2 has been designed also to be a pipeline that can send hydrogen, and the Russians are already planning to become a major hydrogen exporter, hydrogen being one of the new gases that is supposed to replace natural gas as part of the transition from fossil fuels, and which the Germans claim to be so interested. So the article from Bloomberg by then continues to say that the reality is that Merkel's obstinate defense of Nord Stream 2 will count as a stain on her legacy. Well, I'm going to say straight away that the suggestion that Merkel wasn't prepared to move an inch on Nord Stream 2 is nonsense also, because the United States and the opponents of Nord Stream 2 in the United States and in Europe were not asking for an inch from her. They were demanding outright cancellation of the entire pipeline. So it's given that the pipeline is fully in Germany's commercial and economic interests, What the Americans were demanding of Merkel and of Germany was was something which Merkel simply could not afford to do. I would add that if that pipeline, if Nord Stream 2, had been cancelled by Merkel this year in the way that the Americans and some of the critics of Nord Stream 2 in Europe were demanding, then it is highly likely that the support of the CDU in the German election in September would have collapsed. So I think, again, that people do not understand the political and economic imperative of this pipeline for Germany. But anyway, that is the American view. Angry, sour, critical of Merkel. And by the way, I have to say that I am astonished by the fact that Merkel's understated and often deceitful way with partners and allies should have come as a surprise, given that that it is in fact the way that Merkel always works. So when I read comments in Bloomberg to that effect about how Merkel has acted in a cloaked and understated way, as is her wont, again, I wonder what planet some people are on, given that that is, as I said, Merkel's usual method of operation. But regardless, what do the Russians now say? Well, it's been accompanied, the completion of Nord Stream 2 has been accompanied by a massive article by Vladimir Putin on the topic of Russian-Ukrainian relations. And I should say that though Putin claims in this article that it all arose, that the writing of this article arose as a result of a prompt he got in the question and answer marathon that he went through, that he had last week. I don't believe that. This article is very long and it's very discursive, and it deals with many issues of Russian and Ukrainian history, and it is clearly the work of many months. I suspect that the Russians had it ready for a very long time and were preparing to publish it at precisely the time when Nord Stream 2 was either completed or was close to completion. Anyway, summarizing a very long and very detailed and in fact very interesting and well-written article, what Putin basically says is that Russia and Ukraine form part of the same linguistic, cultural and religious space, that Russia, Ukraine and Belarus are all products of the former Russian great Russian state of the early Middle Ages, before it was disrupted by the invasions of the Mongols and the Tatars. And though he appears to accept the independence and sovereignty of Ukraine at the moment, he clearly thinks that Ukraine, Russia and Belarus ought to integrate and rebuild together, because he says that they are natural partners, as all three being ultimate successors of that Russian state that had existed in the Middle Ages, each sharing its common traditions and history. And he also, of course, points out correctly that these three regions became part first of the Russian Empire and then of the Soviet Union. And then he goes on to say, and is highly critical of Soviet practice, which he said created within Ukraine a conception of Ukraine which was somehow differentiated from Russia, which he appears to feel was wrong and untrue. Now, I know many people are going to take issue with these ideas. I have no doubt, by the way, that Putin himself sincerely believes them. But anyway, you can pick on them and argue and dispute with them as much as you wish. They're all set out in his article, and it's not my purpose in this program to comment upon them here. What I wanted to say, and what I think this article is ultimately all about, is that Putin in this article makes what I think is a fully valid point. This is that Ukraine's economy and culture and society are so tightly integrated with Russia's that Ukraine can only prosper as a state and as a nation if it works closely with Russia, in partnership with Russia, rather than in conflict with it. And he says that the crisis that has arisen in Russian-Ukrainian relations, especially since 2014, is a product of a divide and conquer policy pursued against Russia and Ukraine by the Western powers. And here, by the way, he also refers back to similar policies followed in the past by Poland and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he says that these policies of divide and rule have not helped Ukraine, but they have in fact led to its poverty and immiseration and its decline. And he discusses the way in which these policies have destroyed Ukrainian industry in the east of the country and have left Ukraine poor. And he suggests that the way for Ukraine, the correct way forward for Ukraine, is now to turn east, to re-engage with its natural partner, which is Russia, and to forget about this abusive relationship with Europe and with the West, which has instead led Ukraine to poverty and political and economic disaster. Now, obviously, this is a self-serving view. I mean, this is clearly what Putin would like to see. And one has to say that it's obviously a perspective of Ukraine which serves Russian interests. But I'm also going to say this. It's very difficult when reading this article to deny its underlying truth. Ultimately, Ukraine has never recovered to the point that it had achieved economically during the Soviet Union. It has indeed seen its great industries, shipbuilding, mechanical engineering, iron and steel, all of those things, all of those industries, its aircraft industry, its rocket industry, many parts of its high-tech industry. It's seen them all unravel and diminish, even its agricultural industry. And once Ukraine was indeed the breadbasket of the former Russian Empire and of the Soviet Union, even its agricultural sector is falling behind the extraordinary growth of the Russian agricultural sector over the last decade. So in this, he is right. And he is probably also right in saying that the Russians are indeed interested in a successful and economically vibrant Ukraine because of the way it promotes synergies within their own economy, whereas for the West, Ukraine is important not for its economic strengths, but rather as part of a geopolitical play directed against Russia. And of course, Putin talks at length in this article about how the West wants to transform Ukraine into an anti-Russian Russia, something which I think many Ukrainians will seethe over. But again, it contains more than a grain of truth. Now, Putin does not discuss Nord Stream 2 in this article, but when he points out that the Europeans will always pursue their own economic interests in the end, and they will do so at Ukraine's expense, he is, of course, saying something which is not only true, but which the events surrounding Nord Stream 2 have to a great extent reinforced. Because here, indeed, we see an existential issue for Ukraine, or at least one which the Ukrainians claim is existential, being sacrificed by that interest being sacrificed by the Germans as they pursue their own economic interests. The point here is that whilst it is in Russia's economic interests to have a successful, prosperous and friendly Ukraine, it is not in Germany's. Germany has no interest in Ukraine in that respect because Ukraine is not part of Germany's economic space. It's not part of its natural economic space. So that is the point that Putin is trying to make. If Ukraine pivots back to Russia, its economy will recover and grow because it is in Russia's interests that it should. Ukraine and Russia being natural economic partners, but when it pivots towards the West, its economy and its society decline because it is entering into a relationship which in economic terms is an unnatural one. And again, it's a self-serving argument that Putin is making, but again, I feel there is a fundamental truth to it. Certainly, it makes much more sense than these endless attempts to say that Nord Stream 2 is not an economic or commercial project, when, as I said, it makes economic and commercial sense for both the Russians and the Germans. It does make economic sense for the Russians to buy, let's say, gas turbines from Ukraine. It doesn't make sense for Germany to, because it has other sources of supply for gas turbines, and to a great extent, it makes them itself. In fact, Siemens is a major manufacturer. So Putin is right, and ultimately, and perhaps it's time now for Ukrainians to start thinking about this and start to consider carefully what Putin is saying. Now, I think it's going to be very difficult, given the head of steam that has blown up in Ukraine over the last decades, much of which is taken a virulently anti-Russian form, for Ukraine to change course. But Ukrainian business people, oligarchs if you like, being perhaps more practical people, might start to see or recognize some validity in the points that Putin is making. Well, we will see. But the outcome, the decision ultimately relies or depends upon Ukraine itself. Russia offers Ukraine a genuine partnership. Europe and ultimately the United States see Ukraine as part of an anti-Russian political play. The experience of Nord Stream 2 ought to have made that obvious. We will see whether people in Ukraine are capable of understanding that. Well, thank you for joining me on this long program, on this topic, which I've returned to far too often. As I said, I'm actually exhausted by the many discussions I've had on Nord Stream 2. I hope that there won't be many more programs and that this pipeline will indeed be finished this year. But putting all that aside, I thank you for joining me on this program. I look forward to you joining me for other programs, perhaps on hopefully on different subjects, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran. Please also remember to check out my colleague Alex Christophorou's channel. You find links under this video. Please look us up also on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU and Locals, as well as others. Please also support us to the extent that you can via Patreon, Subscribestar and PayPal. And also don't forget to go to our shop, buy yourself the great things that you will find there, our famous magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, and all the rest. And last but not least, if you like this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. And thank you again for joining me on this program today, and have a wonderful day, and I look forward to you joining me again soon.